Welcome, everyone, to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training's virtual diplomatic lunch discussion. As part of our mission to strengthen public appreciation of American diplomacy and enrich professional knowledge by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of U.S. diplomats, this series features policy experts and authors who contribute to our storytelling via their books and discussions like today's. We invite you to learn more, support our efforts, and sign up to preserve your own oral history at adst.org. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Rincon. I'm an active duty FSO with ADST. I'll serve as the moderator today. We're really pleased to have with us today John Dickson. He's the author of History Shock, When History Collides with Foreign Relations. During a career spanning over 25 years, John served the United States as a Foreign Service officer in North America, in South America, in the Caribbean, and in Africa. And in his book, he offers firsthand vignettes and stories with history to highlight the interaction between history and foreign relations. He underscores as well the costs of not knowing history of our partners or our adversaries, much less our own. So John is active. He teaches foreign affairs at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and he's the founder and the president of Encore de la Paix, which is a service organization for returned Peace Corps volunteers from Gabon. So today we're going to examine the role of apology, its relevance to our understanding of foreign policy, and the importance of remembering and acknowledging our past. So I'm sure we're in for an insightful discussion. I'd love to turn it over to John. The floor is yours, and welcome.
Good, thank you, Mark. Great to be with you. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you and your colleagues at ADST for all that you do to promote the practice, study of diplomacy in the United States. In my book, I do point to the increased, one obvious conclusion is a need for increased training of our diplomats. So I found it personally underwhelming, the training that I had, particularly the area studies, the training before I went to each of my posts really relied on my own initiative to do the background reading that I had to do. And I know organizations like ADST really try to fill gaps as much as they can. So I appreciate all you're doing. As Mark said, my book was a bit of a personal exploration. I came to see in my daily interactions, particularly in Mexico, one of my latter posts, that I encountered repeatedly experiences and occasions where history intruded. In some cases, history got in the way of our effort to work together on issues of bilateral concern. In other cases, I found knowing history played actually a constructive role in the same way. And in more cases than not, I confess to not knowing the history at all. I started writing this book shortly after I retired in 2013, but had been unsettled by this engagement with history for years prior to that. I would say this confusion, or what I call shock, is not confined to foreign affairs. And right now, in the last couple of years, we've been, as a nation, in the middle of a national discussion about history, about our history, about histories of communities within our borders that have been ignored and overlooked. And we, over the course of our time as a nation, we've denied it. Or how do we emphasize this history? What's a proper balance now to redress this ignoring of the history? And is this a discussion worth having at all? And these are some of the questions I address in relation to foreign affairs, because should we as a nation also be reviewing, unearthing the role of the U.S. overseas with all of the warts and shortcomings? And is this something that is feasible? Could it actually be helpful? And I call my book History Shock kind of a gimmick, obviously related to culture shock. And it grew out of an assignment for a class I took after retiring. I went back to UMass, University of Massachusetts in Amherst, to actually explore this. I wanted to find what was going on in this connection between history and memory and foreign affairs. And what the reason I call it History Shock was I found myself I was prepared for culture shock when I went overseas, this sensation that we all have found ourselves in foreign countries and not really knowing or understanding the full extent of what was going on. So I was prepared for that, but I was not prepared as much for the shock of history. Nowhere, and I would be glad to hear from you. I believe nowhere does history play such a prominent role in our foreign relations as it does in Mexico. I wasn't in Mexico long before I realized that for Mexicans, their relationship to the United States revolves around 1848 and the loss of half of their territory in the war. I saw this daily in the newspapers. I saw it in my interactions with Mexicans. In the book, I quote Carlos Fuentes, the famed author, who from his book, the El Gringo Viejo, he says, memory and resentment go hand in hand. I got to the point where I would say Mexicans wake up in the morning, they look in the mirror and they see 1848, they see history. And it's not just 1848. I knew a little, and we as a country, me as well, probably as part of that, preferred to forget. I wasn't alone. In the book, I describe a survey that was undertaken by an organization called the Lincoln in Mexico Project out of San Diego. In 2014, this group decided to survey the length of the border, the original border that marked the original boundaries. And they said, and I quote, they encountered only a few people who barely seemed to grasp that Mexico once encompassed all of present-day Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, more than half of Colorado, and smaller portions of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And I saw this little incidents, daily occurrences, not the grand stuff of major negotiations that we know of, that we read about in the papers or that fill the pages of those foreign policy or foreign affairs, but these were small encounters where the Mexican view of their history with the US got in the way. It obstructed our ability to cooperate. And I describe several of them in the book. An incident at the archaeological site with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright at Monte Alban, the archaeological site in Oaxaca. I describe a funeral of a Mexican soldier in the town of Guanajuato. I described the launching of the Northern Command, the Northcom, and how the Mexicans misunderstood that, sometimes almost willfully. They did not want to appreciate what it was we were trying to do, but it all went back to these views of the United States, I believe, intervening and treading on national sovereignty. These connected to their competing history, but also they depended a little, more than a little, on my not knowing the history as well. And so I asked myself what was going on, and I did go back to the university to study this connection. And as I delved into this, I began to notice that this pattern from Mexico, I trudged up memories of other events in my other assignments, whether it was South Africa, Canada, Peru. I never served in Haiti or Cuba, but from Washington and WHA, I did work on those two countries as well. And I describe history shock it comes when you ask the question, why didn't I know this before? How come this is new? Now, why wasn't I aware that the US had occupied Haiti for 19 years, beginning in 1915, and that atrocities had occurred, that the US Congress had even investigated these? Or that we had resorted to the French system of forced labor, what was called the corvée, hated in Haiti, in this country that was alone in the world in its success, rebelling against slavery. Why didn't I know that up to 11,000 people may have died because of bloody guerrilla fighting over the 19 years? And other histories likewise shocked me. I don't remember, and I was a teacher of history, I don't remember in any history text the fact that the Americans burned the city of York, now Toronto, in the War of 1812, before the British burned Washington, D.C. I hadn't heard of Teddy Roosevelt's blatant grab of Panama, manufacturing a revolt against Colombian rule to send in American forces and restore order so he could build a canal across the isthmus, when the Colombians had denied him that. And this was a maneuver of manufacturing crises that was repeated almost like a playbook in Guatemala and Nicaragua and Iran. And the same playbook was used at the Bay of Pigs. And I call it a playbook because the same people who were involved in Guatemala ended up working on the planning of the Bay of Pigs. I probably should have known how prominently the Platt Amendment played in Cuba, but my knowledge of the Spanish-American War in 1898 really was limited to Roosevelt, the Rough Riders. The Platt Amendment passed after the war gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba, gave the U.S. control over its foreign and military policies, as well as the base of Guantanamo. And it stood until 1934, and Platt became shorthand all across the continent for U.S. interventionism. And it was a term that Fidel Castro used repeatedly in his speeches as he took power and for years afterward. And again, in other countries as well, I didn't know, for example, that Malcolm X had been to Nigeria in 1964 and made statements about American diplomats trying to sugarcoat race relations in the US as progress. And those comments still resonated 20 years later when I arrived. We not only forgot those things, we didn't even know that Malcolm X had been there saying that, but the Nigerians obviously didn't forget it. So I began to lump all these incidents together around the question, why didn't I know that? And I called that history shock. And it is something that I think is happening in the United States right now, domestically. I can't tell you up here in this corner of the world, but elsewhere, how many times people said, why didn't I know about the massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921? Why didn't I know about Juneteenth? Why didn't I know that the first enslaved people arrived in the US in 1619? And so for discussion purposes, I pose the question, what should we be doing with this information, if anything? Does it get in the way of managing our relations with other countries? I believe it does. Shouldn't we be doing something about it? So one thing I raise in the book in one chapter is the issue of apology. And it's a chapter on wreath laying. And I draw from a book and research written by a woman named Jennifer Lunt. And the book is called Sorry States. And she chronicles the statements and actions of Germany and Japan in the years following World War II. As early as 1951, Germany started paying reparations. In 1970, German Chancellor Willy Brandt fell to his knees at a memorial to the thousands of Jews who lost their lives in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this spontaneous gesture became a symbol of German atonement for Nazi crimes. And Lynn goes on to postulate that failure to acknowledge past aggression and atrocities can fuel distrust and elevate threat perception. But she also acknowledges a political backlash for leaders who take steps to atone or apologize for past behaviors. And I was reminded of Mitt Romney, who wrote his campaign book in 2012, and the title was No Apology. He painted Barack Obama as the apology president, going on apology tours, and echoing George H.W. Bush's earlier statement, I will never apologize for the United States. I don't even care what the facts are, President Bush said. And he said this following the shootdown of the Iranian civil airliner in the Persian Gulf in 1988, an obvious mistake. But the fact of the matter is, there are instances of American apology, and we know of them. We know of the Japanese internment in the United States, the takeover of Hawaii in the late 1800s. We're not alone. The British apologized and paid reparations for their role of torture in the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya. Canada is paying reparations for the First Nations boarding schools, and they're unearthing new information about cemeteries on those First Nations boarding school campuses. And one thing that had completely bypassed me was that Secretary of State Warren Christopher apologized for State Department inaction of an atrocity in El Salvador that occurred during their civil war. But is apology the only response? No. And I would say simply remembering the history is also a response. Recognizing, acknowledging our past behavior is on a continuum of atonement. And there's a sociologist by the name of Irving Goffman who talks about this continuum, that he goes from acknowledging to disavowing to repenting and to offering restitution. When President Obama went to Hiroshima in 2016, there was a widely publicized debate in advance of whether Obama would apologize. He didn't, but it was unclear right up until his travel what would happen. Instead, he laid a wreath and made some comments about eliminating nuclear weapons in the future. And it was a simple gesture, not an apology, but it was a recognition of this terrible, difficult moment that changed the course of human history at that point. Prime Minister Abe returned the visit. He went to Pearl Harbor. He also laid a wreath and also did not apologize. Obama was not the first to lay a wreath. We all have been ourselves participants in wreath-laying ceremonies around the world, I'm sure. But I found out in the course of my studying for this, even though I had served in Mexico for 5 years and worked on the Mexican desk for another year, that Harry Truman laid a wreath in 1947 when he went to Mexico at the memorial for the Niños Héroes. It was a spontaneous gesture. Truman had wanted to go to Mexico as president, and he had chosen the year 1948, and the Mexicans said, no, you can't come in 1948. That's the 100th anniversary of this war. And so there again, he did not appreciate the depth of feelings that Mexicans had. And so what did he do? He advanced his travel. And while there, the American ambassador, a man named Thurston, recommended that Truman just go up the street on Reforma Avenue in Chapultepec Park and lay the wreath for these child soldiers who threw themselves off the walls of Chapultepec Castle rather than surrender to the Americans in 1848. The response that Truman got from this spontaneous gesture was enormously positive, immediate. He was embraced. But the one thing that this helped do was one of the reasons that Truman went to Mexico was to try to get the Mexicans to sign up to this new proposal, the Organization of American States. And shortly after that visit, I think a lot because of Truman's spontaneous recognition of Mexican history, they did join the OAS and sign the Rio Treaty. It's an example that Jennifer Lynn said, it is a way to help the relationship move forward. I have two more examples in the book where the US actually did use history to advance our foreign relations, as opposed to many others where we had forgotten the history. And one of them has to do with the office in the State Department of Cultural Property. We signed an agreement shortly before I arrived in Peru that we would return stolen and looted archaeological artifacts to the country. And so every couple of months, the US Customs would send back to us at the embassy, and we would arrange with the Peruvians this ceremony of returning these items. Peru sees itself, its identity is wrapped up in its pre-Columbian history. And it was a tremendous gesture that we were returning these looted items, some of them very made of gold and very expensive, very coveted. And, and our ambassador, who used these occasions to what I would call, and what other people have called, to fill up the reservoir of goodwill, at the same time, he would also make comments about Peru's, the government's record on human rights, its backtracking on democracy. But what I think it showed to the average Peruvian, even though there were on the wall, on the walls around the city were signs telling the ambassador, jet, go home. But I think the average Peruvian, it helped them understand that, here's the United States showing respect to Peru for what matters to Peru, as well as, and he was able to make these other comments in a manner that the Peruvians still, I think, appreciated that the United States was showing respect for them. The other example I have in the book is of the Smithsonian Institution following the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. You've all seen and remember perhaps how the incredible effort put together by the United States to support the Haitians in this devastating earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands of people and made even more homeless. And we had military there. We had all the government agencies there. I went down for 3 weeks. The embassy was overrun. People were sleeping as I was, in closets. They were sleeping outside on the embassy grounds. Everybody was working on this. And in the midst of this, trying to save lives, the Smithsonian Institute says they wanted to come down and work with their Haitian colleagues who were trying to recover and protect all of their national patrimony, their art, their documents, their archives that had also been destroyed. Well, this became a little controversial because the embassy said too many people here. They didn't want to give them country clearance. And the Smithsonian says, we don't need country clearance because we're an independent agency. And they came anyway. They set up a training. And over the course of the next year, they worked with the Haitians to save this art, these murals in cathedrals that are very famous and very well known. So the Smithsonian had a good analogy, that how important something like this is. They made the analogy of what would happen if there's an earthquake or some kind of disaster in Washington, and we would want these documents, these founding documents, to be saved. And in fact, one of our few memories of the War of 1812 was Dolly Madison saving the portrait of Washington from the White House. So these things resonate and mean a lot, even when there is harm and danger and risk to human life. So how do we improve our historical literacy and awareness? And obviously, I mentioned at the beginning, training has a big piece of it. The fact that we do area studies, I had 2 weeks of area studies that covers all of one continent and maybe one afternoon in history for one part of the continent is just insufficient. I cite a book by 2 Harvard professors called Thinking in Time. And these 2 professors did case studies bringing in government officers government officials who would remember how they drew on history in the middle of crises, whether it was nuclear war negotiations or whether it was the Bay of Pigs or even something domestic as social security negotiations. So I think these are examples of easy ways. And then there's another book written by Jerome Surrey and Hal Brands who say we just need to develop a historical sensibility, which is not a lot of help, but I think if we dwell on that a few minutes and think about what that involves, and what they say it involves is, before making major decisions, is just to pause and try to identify, are there analogies, are there examples that we should be drawing on from history before we decide a course of action. So I've been talking quite a bit. Let me stop here. I've opened up. I hope a few lines for discussion. What are we to do? How do we acknowledge the negative repercussions of U.S. actions outside our borders? I do think it's something that is pertinent and relevant now, especially as we are looking at the aftermath of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and even 20 years of Afghanistan. What is our requirement here to acknowledge and appreciate what has transpired?
Excellent. No, thank you for those initial comments. Again, ladies, gentlemen, I encourage you to use the chat function or raise your hand to make any comments or to ask a question yourself. I'm wondering if I might take the moderator's privilege to stay on a point that you raised there at the end regarding Afghanistan. For some of the younger officers around, I mean, we've gone through a time, at least for me, during my entire diplomatic career, the United States has been heavily involved in Afghanistan. So given kind of recent events, what do you think we've learned as a country, or what role might that play? You mentioned as diplomats, training is very important, and area studies could certainly be bolstered for some of us. But what about, given the newfound concentration of policymaking domestically, is there a role for us domestically, both within the government or even in general public, to help appreciate these differences? What might you suggest about that?
Well, that's a huge question, Mark, and I would have hoped that some congressman would have asked General Milley and General Austin, Secretary of Defense Austin, yesterday that kind of question. A couple things on Afghanistan, and I think there are people probably on the call who have closer, and everybody I'm sure has opinions on this, so I would open it up. You know, I mentioned the example of Haiti and our occupation of Haiti for almost 20 years in the early years of the 1900s. And I didn't make the connection between Afghanistan and Haiti until right around the time when we were pulling out and those terrible images we were all watching. I was talking with a colleague, a friend of mine who worked for CARE and who had gone to Haiti, had gone to Afghanistan over the course of those 20 years. And he made the comment to me, you know, we did an awful lot there. We built schools, we built roads, we put infrastructure in. And it struck me as he was talking about this, that you could have taken that exact same quote and gone back to one of those congressional hearings in the early 1900s on U.S. role in Haiti, and you would have seen the exact same comments that what we did in Haiti during those years that we occupied Haiti were we built roads, we built schools, we put in infrastructure. So these were positive things. And so I was struck. All of a sudden, I thought, wait a minute, what is the connection between what we did in Haiti and what our recent experience in Afghanistan? I do think that and this is a personal opinion, is our ability to come in and stay in other countries for extended periods of time is limited. The one advantage the Taliban had in those final months was they were Afghanistans for the most part. I'm sure there were other nationalities there, but we were not. And I think that's should be a lesson learned and certainly was learned in the first Iraq War, very different circumstances, but we did not stay. President Bush decided we're not going to go to Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein at the time. But I would be very interested in hearing people on the call and what other people might have in that regards to Afghanistan and what we do now with Afghanistan. I think, and I know up here in my hometown, we're going to be receiving Afghan refugees. I think this is a big piece of it. It happened after the Vietnam War when we received Cambodians and Vietnamese. So that would be one element of it. But let me stop there.
Well, thank you. And there is a comment from Stephanie Kinney, who had to drop off the call, but we will follow up. She'd like to be put in touch with you, and also points out the importance of following up on this topic. It's a good topic, and it begs the question for how we can improve. So we will make sure that we connect you as well. Other questions or comments are welcome. I'm wondering if I could continue. John, you have extensive experience, and you mentioned history shock. You took a lot of the examples from firsthand experience, being in a lot of these countries in Africa and in Central and South America. How do you balance, I suppose, when as diplomats we go out, and given our long diplomatic history in places like Vietnam or Iran or in other areas in the Middle East, as a diplomat, you mentioned the role of apology as a country, but did that ever play a major role for you personally when local country, host country interlocutors might have seen you as, when you represent the United States, as, you know, having to pay for the past sins of our government? When do you find that helped erode trust, or was there a way to build trust? Could you comment a little bit about your personal experiences in some of these countries? You mentioned Mexico and Haiti in particular, but how do you see that playing out?
So I certainly, and I cite in the book, I did apologize for the country, and I had to. There was an occasion during the first, during the NATO-led, U.S. NATO-led intervention in Yugoslavia, when we were bombing key infrastructure parts. As a public affairs officer, I went out and gave talks about the threat of someone like Slobodan Milosevic posed to countries, to their own populations. It is incumbent upon the world to stand up and not allow him to harm his own population. And it just so happens that I was at a conference, and I knew that the ambassador to China would be another speaker at this conference, and I would be following him right afterwards, or we would be at the podium on the same hourly period. Well, it turned out that the night before we spoke was when when we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Several Chinese were killed, and so I had in mind I was going to certainly apologize for this terrible tragedy to the ambassador and in public as well. He left before as I was walking up. He would not even stay on the podium with me. So I did get a chance to apologize for him. I do think there are examples that I remember in what we did to redress, and they weren't always apologies. I spent a fair amount of time in the chapter on Canada, how the Canadians were very upset that we did not properly thank them for all their support for us on 9/11. And would they remember a time 9 days after 9/11 when President Bush gave an address to Congress, a joint session of Congress, and started listing off the countries that had helped. And he started off with, "We have no truer friend in the world than Great Britain." And he listed 4 or 5 other countries, and he omitted Canada completely. The Canadians, it's now a Broadway play. The Canadians, received dozens and dozens of planes of passengers that were grounded in their territory in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. And we have pictures of all of these planes that were stranded. And the Canadians opened up their homes, individual, very spontaneous. And it was, in their eyes, it was an omission and it was a small thing, but it is a perception that does cloud and get in the way. And until we dealt with it, it would always keep coming up. And we dealt with it in 3 or 4 ways. President Bush, after winning his second term, his first foreign visit was to go to Canada and acknowledge that he had omitted Canada, and gave a speech saying that Condoleezza Rice came up on the 5th anniversary, did the same thing. We put a plaque up outside the embassy acknowledging all that Canada had done for us on 9/11. So those are small things that I think where we did make an effort to acknowledge and do redress. It wasn't a hard thing to do. There are harder things to do, perhaps. The example I give of Warren Christopher in El Salvador was there was a massacre that was taking place in a village in El Salvador, in El Mozote. And the embassy there knew it was happening, but there were, for political reasons, because of the discussions back in Washington over support for the Contras, and that we sat on it and denied that there was a massacre. It had nothing to do with the United States, but just the fact that the U.S. denied that it was even happening. Even after 2 U.S. journalists had traveled to this village, we denied it. And Warren Christopher made it a point. He did a thorough, and he did an investigation, and he acknowledged that we sat on information that we had that might have made a difference in terms of other activities in El Salvador afterwards. I did see one question mark about what's the role for ADST?
Yes, that's right. That's coming from Susan Johnson, and it's a part of what we do is outreach. But in light of your work on this book, do you have any thoughts about what ADST could do to promote the study of history on our diplomatic relations, and what's an effective way to do it? Because, of course, not all history books cover the facts, so that could play a role as well. What might you suggest?
I think there must be a way in the pre-departure area studies courses and so forth for ADST to become more involved in as officers are going out to post, preparing them. For me to have gone to Mexico without ever even trying to take advantage of the archives that ADST has, I think was a mistake. I didn't even know they existed at the time. I knew ADST was doing oral histories. I did not know that that there were ones, but that would be one that we make available to people going out to post. Here's a database of archives that will give you some background. And I think the same thing with the Office of the Historian. It's an underutilized resource for both officers who are departing for the field, but even officers in the field when they're interacting. I know the Office of the Historian every now and then would send out a little 2-page history brief on some event that's happening, but I don't know how widespread those things. I think it's underutilized. And I think Susan had mentioned earlier that people who use the archives of ADST and the Office of the Historian, the Foreign Affairs archives that are so well put together, are really from universities. They're not officers. We don't use them, and I think we ought to have a more systematic way of taking advantage of all of these things that they're available to universities and academics who are writing their PhD dissertations, using them, and that we don't use them as much or at all.
Right. We do have a follow-on question related to that. We have a couple, but this one from Robin Matthewman, she writes, as far as what we should do to correct this, she wanted to ask whether folks think it's feasible to have a class on U.S. diplomatic history, say at FSI, and if we can make that accessible to a wide variety of staff, similar to the MOOCs that had been done with public diplomacy. Do you think that would be a feasible option as well?
Yeah, I think it would be great. I think it would be fantastic. And maybe, I don't know if you all remember, but the Foreign Service Journal, when after the election, they invited people to write a memo to the new administration. And so I wrote a little memo, and they actually published it in the Foreign Service Journal about the need for more history in our training. And when I did that, I checked on what the military does for their training. And I found out that their area officers, who we all interacted with around the world, they're given a master's degree before they go out. So they get a whole year of academic study, and then they go out to the region and they spend a year of study without doing any work. That's what and again, that may have changed. I don't know how accurate it is. This is what I saw in their curriculum, in their stated. So here, military. Now, I'm not saying that every Foreign Service officer should have a master's degree, or that we certainly don't have the luxury of sending people out and spending a year just getting to know the country or the region. But I would say more than, again, I had a 2-week area study course before going to Peru. I think they might have talked about Peru for 30 minutes because they're looking at all of Latin America. It's just totally inadequate and insufficient. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, we have an insightful question from Carol Peasley, who is asking, if the United States had better understood the role and the losses of the Soviet Union during World War II, in other words, their history, do you think we would have made different choices during the 1990s as a country if we understood their role in history, but a bit better?
Oh, I don't doubt it. I think I remember in my own study at university hearing about the Soviet Union feeling that the world was, that a lot of their actions leading up to the Cold War were really defensive in nature, trying to survive, which is very different than the other line, that this was an aggressive country trying to expand and make the world safe for communism during the Cold War. But certainly this survival instinct in the Soviet Union and Russia is deep. And I'd have to defer to anybody else who's been in that part of the world. I have not. I don't. One thing I found, Mark, was as I talked to people, colleagues who were in different parts of the world than I was, and most of my career was WHA and a little AF, was people, whether they were in Cambodia or Vietnam or the Philippines or other places, Poland, they all have their stories of history shock, of times when, President Obama's going to announce a change in the visas for Poland. Well, he picked a day that was so important to U.S.-Polish relations that the Polish remember something, and I forget what it was offhand, but the officer who was in Poland at the time said, why did he pick this one day to make this announcement that Poles were going to have to now apply for visas instead of being part of the visa waiver program? To throw that out on a day that had such a different meaning. And that's what we're supposed to do as officers overseas, is to alert decision makers.
Right. Well, a colleague, Margaret Kelvey, has an interesting point that she raises, that in her experience within the State Department, many officers are so focused on proving their merit, getting a good evaluation, that they can't afford to really learn history and what could be done about that, and what might be worth learning. And I think it raises the point about, you mentioned in DC, and you and I had the pleasure of interacting during my time in INL, your time with the Mexico office, that we're so focused on the current crisis. In what way could we make the time? Officers may have a chance to go to, say, the War College and really learn case studies, but that's more the exception than the rule. Do you have any thoughts of how that might be more institutionalized, in a person's career from the State Department point of view?
Well, and I would say, Mark, I was totally guilty. I did not want to take time away from my career to go and do more than a prolonged period of training. I thought this would set me back. I was moving forward, and I think there is that role. But I think I look back on it now and see that this was obviously a mistake on my part. I did the best I could to learn while I was on the job. But you're right. We're so tied to our desks and to the inbox of emails and cables that are coming in, and how do we have time for that? And this is what I think the thinking in time people talk about, and how Brands and Jerome stories is the pause, and to pause before the decision making, and to just look backwards, and to ask the questions that happened, that are related. Is there an analogical historical analogy situation that is appropriate? And obviously they're not all appropriate, but is this something that could be used? Now, I give another example in WHA was that the military wanted to set up to reorganize Southcom wanted to reorganize their naval operations. And so they wanted to call it the Fourth Fleet. And they did. They made a big announcement. We're going to set up the Fourth Fleet in the hemisphere. Well, it was one man in my office of public affairs who had a PhD in history, who knew Latin American history left and right. He said, you can't do that. The Fourth Fleet will bring up all kinds of connotations to the average Latin American of a history of U.S. interventionism, where we used whatever was gunboat diplomacy. We sent the Navy to all these places. Please don't call it the decision's already been made. And sure enough, Hugo Chavez and Daniel Ortega and others just jumped all over that and accused the U.S. of using this new Fourth Fleet, even though it was only an administrative technicality of reorganizing it. They used it to just draw up all of those historic connotations. Mm-hmm. I did see, Mark, one chat box, somebody said, do you think that the short tours are a problem? Absolutely they are.
Right, right. So extending time in any particular assignment might be helpful if that were built in as well. That's a good point. That's a good point.
And, I know why we don't do it, because somehow something in our bones of being Americans, we develop clientitis more than happens perhaps in other countries. But the fact that I was able to work on Mexico for 6 years or on South Africa for 6 years really, I felt, gave me an advantage of fully and being able to anticipate what the Mexican reaction might be. We all have our memories, but when you and I, Mark, were working on this Merida initiative, and I remember going over to the Senate and trying to get them to convince them that this would be a package of a large amount of money that would be to the United States advantage. And these staffers, some of whom are in very prominent positions now, because we were talking to staffers on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, were saying things like, we've got to certify, the Mexicans have to certify, we have to be able to certify that they're making progress. Well, certification in Mexico was a dirty word, and conditionality was, and we kept talking, and they kept saying, well, this is our money. And I said, of course you have to know that it's going to a right place. And finally, somebody said from the Senate Foreign Relations staff said, the Mexicans just have to get over their sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, and again, it didn't take my having spent 6 years to know that how important sovereignty is as an issue to Mexico. You probably needed only 3 weeks. But still, if you've never been there, you don't say a statement like that. Right. I know it was in the privacy of a conference room, but anyway, we were able to work that whole program out without using the word condition or certification or get over your sovereignty.
That's the challenge. Well, we do have 2 comments, and I know I'm being respectful of people's time, but I will share this one from Robert Bothwell. he mentions, as a consumer of ADST, he uses the interviews in his books and in teaching, and he takes the opportunity to express appreciation. So we're thankful for that. Since we have a large U.S. consulate in town, he says, we've occasionally employed visits from some of the consuls general, especially the one who in 2003 told a private dinner of students that she was opposed to the Iraq War. She made more friends that day than is usually the case. As for prepping for your Canadian assignment, where on earth in the US have you taken Canadian history? Where would you have taken that? It isn't a matter of grievance. He was just saying, as a fact. So that's to be aware. And then Susan Johnson, I will reiterate a point she makes. She says, I think it's time to rethink how we implement up or out and competitive promotion vis-a-vis our peers. We should have an early tenure threshold and another at the senior most level. In between, it should be more of a pass-fail, with promotions coming at pretty much predetermined intervals, X years at 03, 02, 01, etc. So in between, she suggests a different approach. What are your thoughts on how we've done promotions as well?
Yeah, I think the pressure to get promoted quickly is such that people like myself didn't really want to go through the training that might have been required and would have helped a better. So I don't know that there's a silver bullet in the promotion, either the precepts or the time in class. I do want to make a comment about the Canadian history, though.
Go ahead.
Only because one of the complaints that Canadians have is we overlook them, we ignore them to such an extent that at one point we had a visitor from the U.S. who had never been to Canada at the 4th of July, was sitting at a big 4th of July dinner and turned to the president of the Hudson Bay Company and said, what do you mean you're not part of the U.S.? And why don't you want to be a part of the U.S.? But there are places in the United States that do study of Canada. The University of North Carolina has one, and they actually have a diplomat, former diplomat there who is working, Steve Kelly, on Canadian history. So there are places that do trilateral history, North American history as well. So I would say that in many ways, it's not vital to our foreign policy that everybody needs to go out and learn Canadian history. But certainly if you're going to Canada, it's very important to think of their history as a separate history that's worthy of and worth studying, as opposed to ours, just for the sheer fact that the Canadians think they have a history that's worth studying, that's different and separate from the United States.
Absolutely. And there's one interesting suggestion from colleague Mark Tauber. He recognizes it wouldn't be easy, but if the department decided to add a requirement for recognition of common historical events in the mission strategic plans in that process, that might help put a little more awareness of history on our radar screens. But this has been a great discussion. I regret as I look at the time that we're coming to a close. So John, really on behalf of ADST and all of us, I wanted to just thank you for a wonderful discussion. I encourage everyone to please visit adst.org, subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and recommend ADST to friends, colleagues, or anyone out there who's hungry for a monthly dose of discussion about the U.S. diplomatic history. And finally, please remember ADST is a private nonprofit organization. We rely on the generosity of our supporters across the country who are inspired by our nonpartisan mission of capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of U.S. diplomats. If you're joining us for the first time, it'd be great if you signal your support with a donation in any amount for things like this discussion series. So we look forward to your participation at other events. Thank you again. The event is officially over, but in keeping with our tradition, you're welcome to stay and chat.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for joining us, and hope